Hello friends, Tanya here for Trinity Stamps, and today we're going to play with a background foil plate and a foil and cut set. This is the Clover background foiling plate. I have foiled it with a rainbow die on, a rainbow foil on some Hammermill cardstock. I pulled out 3 colors to make a rainbow inking. We've got candied apple, squeezed lemonade, and salvaged patina. And I am ink blending that over our foiling. Your foiling will resist any of the water-based products that you're going to put over the top, including Distress Oxides. I did spritz this a little bit with the pearlized water I keep in a spray bottle on my desk, and you can see that I also ink blended it in the opposite direction. Next, we're going to pull out the Shamrock Swirl cut and foil set. There is this beautiful foil plate and 3 dies, an outline die or a large die, an inset die, and a very detailed die that mimics the foil on the foil plate. This is what it looks like when you foil it and use the outside die and the inner die to die cut that out. We're going to use that outline foiled piece to create a shaker. We're going to cut out a piece of acetate with the large, not detailed die, and we'll put that on the back of our foiled piece that's been foiled and cut. I did use some liquid adhesive to adhere that to the back of the die cut, and I used my finger to smooth outward to make sure that all of the glue adheres well to both surfaces. Next, we're going to take the double-sided adhesive strips, and we're carefully going to go around the border of this foiled and die cut piece. These strips work so well for these fine detail shaker elements. They are quite the game changer. If you take the backing off of both sides, you peel it off your packaging, and then before you peel it off the packaging, you peel off your backing, and then you can adhere it in your fine detail ways around your element. Now we're going to fill this with the celebration dots inside our shaker well. You could section off these. No, I guess you can't. It does make one large shaker cavity. If you use the stitched Shamrock, you can create separate wells of shakers, but this one makes one big element. And these little dots are just a fine confetti flat element. It's very dry in the wintertime where I live, so there's a lot of static there. I'm adding some extra adhesive to the back of the foam strips before I add the solid white clover that we're going to do on the back of this to create a completed shaker element. You could add that right to a card, but it is so much easier to add a backer to your shaker element and then adhere it where you want it on your card. Here we have some fun shaker action. Now I'm deciding which of these rainbow ink blended foiled pieces I want to use. I went with the up and down version, and then I pulled out the modern embossed A7 stack and die cut a piece from that. And now we're going to dry emboss with the foiling plate. That is an option. And I do like some dry embossing. So this is kind of letterpress like, and you can see that I use platform A, but you also need platform B, which I discovered when I went to my machine, and I lay the foil plate down, and the foil plate is foil side up, and then you lay the paper over the top of that, and then you use the embossing plate, which is this silicone piece, and then the adapter, which is, so it's D and E. And then you get this beautiful embossed piece of cardstock. I did die cut that with the modern embossed frame also, and I wanted to add another layer of cardstock between the ink blended piece and our dry embossed piece. So I took out that same modern embossed edge A7 stack and we did another layer with that. I think this is one of my most commonly used die sets. It is quite invaluable in my stash. Now we're going to adhere our pieces to our card base, which is a 5x7 card. Both of the cards I'm making on this video are 5x7 cards. We're using very similar products to create both of these cards. We've got our embossed piece adhered directly to the card. Now we will do the ink blended piece on top of the plain white mat. I'm not adding extra height behind any of these. Just going to adhere that in the center of our card. I tend to very much center things. I like how the embossed layer is framing subtly our very bold rainbow background. I know this is very not traditional. The Shamrock or Clover is not at all green, and the shaker bits inside are also a rainbow of colors, with green not being the predominant color. I'm going to adhere that sort of centered in the upper portion of the card, and then I'm going to pull out the Simply Sentimental Lucky Stamp and Die set. We're going to use a couple of sub-sentiments and the shadow layer and the detail layer of this font of Lucky. Now you do not have to use Lucky with the Y on the end. I'm going to adhere just the Luck with tweezers and some fine detail glue. And I had used some very shiny gold metallic cardstock. And then we're going to trim off the Y on Lucky. It's actually very easy to trim this off. It's very well designed in that way, and it only takes a couple quick little snips to get this to be trimmed off very neatly. Now, since this is a metallic paper, you got to be a little careful when you're adhering that so you don't displace them once you get them where you want them, because it does take a little bit of time for them to finish drying. I am stacking this word up with 2 additional layers of black cardstock. This happens to be a fairly lightweight, probably an 80-pound black cardstock, and it does need a little extra help since it's going to be on a very layered card. I just trimmed that off quickly, and now we're going to stamp our 2 sub-sentiments, and I'm stamping these in VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, and with all very detailed stamps, you want to make sure you're just applying light pressure, and if it's not as bold as you would like, doing it repeatedly is better than pushing harder. I only needed to stamp this twice, and now we're going to heat set this with our heat tool so that it becomes all nice and shiny. I have this bin of clear embossing powder that I use for all kinds of things, but predominantly for my sentiments, which I really like to have heat embossed. Next, we're going to pull out the banner die from the Simply Sentimental U. I believe all of the Simply Sentimental stamps and die sets are essentials in your stash. They work for so many things, and they're so well thought out and so well designed. They just are so perfect. You won't need a whole lot more sentiments than this. I do add that as a little tail, so we've got a little bit of luck, and then inside we'll put the second part of this sentiment. We'll line this up so that it overlaps onto the embossed portion, in which case I actually need to add a little bit of cardstock scrap behind the K so that it is flush across the entire card there. Now I'm going to take this sub-sentiment banner that I trimmed off to a straight edge on one side, and we're going to tuck that under the edge of the L here, and we'll adhere that directly to the card front without any extra height. So that's the front of our card. Now inside, I decided to add some stenciling with the Clover Heart stencil. This is such a cool stencil. I really love it. So I'm going to tack it down with a little bit of tape, and I have the Trinity Stamps blender buddies or blending buddies in 3 different colors. I have one for each color family. And we're again going to use the Candied Apple, Squeezed Lemonade, and Salvaged Patina to create our rainbow of Clover hearts here. Our heart of, we're making a rainbow out of the Clover Heart stencil. So I start with the yellow in the middle, and I'll blend in some of the blue from the bottom and get a green where they overlap. Just coming back more and more. I do want this to be fairly bold. You'll still be able to write over it if you wanted, but there's lots of room in this card to write a personal message. Now, my tape did not stick through our entire stenciling, but as you can see, I just used a couple very skinny strips of tape. So now I'm just going to hold it in place while I do the last little bit of ink blending. Just going to dab off some of the red so it doesn't contaminate all of the yellow. We don't want it all to be orange. And I'll go just one more time over with the Squeezed Lemonade. And there we have our completed stenciled heart. And now we're going to take the second part of our sentiment, which says, and a lot of love. So a little bit of luck and a lot of love is what our card is saying. I'm going to adhere that on the right side of the heart. That is card number 1. Moving on to card number 2. I have foiled the Clover background foiling plate on some Hammermill cardstock with some green foil. This is just plain green. I've seen lots of people using the shattered glass green, which is gorgeous, but I'm going to take the time to color all of the clovers on this background. It's a very therapeutic, easy, not complicated coloring. It took me probably half an hour, and I just grabbed 4 colors of green and went to town. I used 2 colors for each clover grouping, and I just picked a size of clover and colored all of that size or style in the 2 color combo that I picked, and then I would move on to another size or style and take the darker color from the first one, because I started with my lightest clovers, the ones that were going to be closest to the surface, and I worked my way back into the background ones, and I just carried the darker color into the next grouping along the way. I encourage you to just reach and grab in your marker collection or your pencils or watercolor crayons or watercolors, and don't be too fussy about what other people use for color combos. Just use what looks good to you and experiment. That's so much of the fun of crafting, when you just explore what your supplies can do. There are several side view almost clovers. There's several of these leaves that are turned, and I made those the darkest. That is all of the coloring. I did come back and use a super light green marker here. I think this is G quadruple 0. And the main reason I did this was not that I wanted a green, light green background, but I wanted to fix some of my less than neat and tidy coloring. I wouldn't have to do that. This background is quite busy, and it is not actually the main focus of this card, but I just decided to go ahead and try this. If I had it to do again, I would leave it be, but this does work kind of like the colorless blender and helps push any of my coloring outside the lines back inside the lines. And that is all of the coloring. Now we're going to move on to trimming this down to what we're going to use for our card. I use the modern embossed A7 stack again, and I've added this, but we're not actually going to use this in any of the cards today. So I turned the plate sideways on our platform, and I foiled it with the pastel, I think it's pastel green is what it's called, foil. And then I laid another piece of it on the part of the 8.5 by 5.5 inch cardstock that did not get foiled yet. I'm going to use some of this low tack tape here, and I'm going to tack it to the already foiled part, and then we're going to lay it on our foil platform. I'm going to turn it around because I need that to not overhang over the handle. And my sandwich is the shim, 4 paper shims, and the spacer for the foiling system. And that will get my complete foiled panel. So if you wanted to use a larger panel, you can extend your foiling. Let's move on to the next portion of this actual part that we're going to use. I have some green cardstock, some green foil, and our Shamrock Swirl foiling plate. And I foiled that on our green cardstock. I just swish that in the air a little bit to cool that before I peel off our foil, and that foiled beautifully. Now we're going to die cut that with the largest die in that foil and cut set. Just going to use a little bit of tape to tack this down, being careful not to get it on the foiling because you could accidentally remove some of your foil. Just next we're going to try to figure out where on our piece we want to place this. And now I want to add the sentiment. I'm going to take the stamp set and stamp out the sentiments, both portions of this. We're going to use this portion on the outside. So again, going to use the VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, which I do stamp twice to get a good solid stamping. And then I'm going to pull out my clear embossing powder again, and we'll heat set that after I get it covered with the powder. And since you're doing a black ink with a clear embossing powder on a white background, I don't necessarily use my anti-static powder tool. If it was the middle of the summer and it was hot and sticky, I might do that more. But since it is the middle of the winter and it is quite dry, I don't seem to need it as much. Next, we're going to take my favorite for sentiments, the mini slimline stitched layers dies, and I'm going to use this third from the smallest die to cut out our sentiment for the front of the card. I am doing partial die cutting here, so I use my tape as a cue to where I want the edge of the cutting plate to end. I'm going to remove that die and slide it back into the previously cut grooves. And since this is a stitched die, you want to be careful that your stitch lines are lined up also. And that is our sentiment. I dry embossed another panel that I had actually die cut first with the Modern Embossed layering die. That did make my edge a little less. The Modern Embossed embossing kind of broke through in one spot, so I guess it really is better to die cut it after you've embossed it in this particular case. I've got our card base here, and I am stamping the sentiment on the inside. I have already put some extra card stock on the back of our embossed piece, and that's why I have the Misty out, because I have that as a heavy weight to make sure that it adheres well. Now I have this Shamrock that I had from a previous crafting session, and I'm going to use that now. I just adhered that inside the card near the sentiment and leaving plenty of space for a personal message to be added to this card. Here we have our embossed piece that I have those extra pieces of cardstock to add a little extra stability, since that piece of cardstock had a lot going on. We'll adhere that nicely to the front of our card, and we'll take our Copic colored background piece and adhere that directly to our card base over the embossed piece, making sure that I have a fairly even boundary all the way around. Next, we're going to take 2 extra layers of cardstock, and yes, you get to see my goof ups all the time in my back my layering pieces. I tend to flip it over and try to use that cardstock again in another way, and if that doesn't work, well then it becomes scratch paper to be used in layering. We've got 2 extra pieces here to layer behind our green shamrock. And then we're going to adhere that to the front of the card. I will confess, I was going to make this a landscape card, but when I stamped the inside of the card, I forgot that. So yeah, portrait it is. Now we'll adhere the sentiment to the shamrock. I'm just trying to figure out the best placement. That's another nice thing with the clear heavyweight block, because even though it's serving a purpose of letting that glue adhere, while I'm waiting, I can be planning the rest of my card. We get that nicely adhered to the front of the card. I decided not to add any extra height behind that, and that finishes off card number 2. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps my channel. If you aren't subscribed, please do that now. That also helps the channel. And leave a comment. All of the interaction that you provide helps get our videos out to more eyeballs. Check that description box below for all of the products that I used today. And until next time, here are a couple more videos I thought you might enjoy. Bye-bye.